Question number 6, Metiria Turei.
Tēnā koe, Mr Speaker. Tēnā koutou i te whare. My question is to the Prime Minister and asks, does he stand...
Order. The conversation must cease. I can't hear the question. Metiria Turei, start again, please.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister and asks, does he stand by his statement that, quote, it makes no sense to be calling for emissions reductions on one hand while subsidising emissions on the other, end quote.
The Honourable Bill English on behalf of the Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, yes.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Metiria Turei.
What is the cost to the taxpayer of all financial support his government provides for fossil fuel exploration and extraction?
The Honourable Bill English on behalf of the Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, the answer to that question depends on whether you follow the World Wildlife Fund definition, which says there are some subsidies, or whether you follow the APEC definition and other international bodies who estimate the cost at zero. That is, that New Zealand has no subsidies to the fossil fuel industry.
Point of order, sir.
Point of order, Metiria Turei.
So I didn't say the word subsidy at all. I asked for the cost to the taxpayer of all financial support provided by the government. That is a different thing.
If you listen carefully to the answer, the Minister explained that it depends the way in which a subsidy is then described. Supplementary question, Metiria Turei.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. How much has the government spent on the 2-for-1 deal under the emissions trading scheme, which does subsidise greenhouse gas polluting industries by up to 50%?
The Honourable Bill English on behalf of the Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I don't have those figures to hand, but it wouldn't be much because the carbon price has been so low. And I know the Greens they liked the ETS until the carbon price went down, where they decided there wasn't enough pain being inflicted on the population at large, so now they've changed to a carbon tax. And I suppose that would earn us quite a lot of revenue.
Order. Point of order. No, I have a point of order from Metiria Turei.
The Minister is simply moving into a criticism of Green Party position. That's not appropriate for an answer.
And I agree with that comment. I probably should have pulled the Minister.
Supplementary.
I'm just ruling. I should have pulled up the Minister earlier. The question was answered right at the start by saying he didn't have that information with him. Supplementary question.
Mr Speaker.
The Honourable Dr Nick Smith.
Is the Prime Minister aware that the last time fossil fuel electricity generation was subsidised in New Zealand was when the Whirinaki power station was built with government subsidies, and when the government provided a guarantee for the new gas-fired power station at Huntly, an initiative that was taken by the previous government supported by the Greens?
The Honourable Bill English on behalf of the Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, yes, I am. I have become aware of that and was very surprised, given the tone of the questions that we've been answering. And actually, as the member may know, since the electricity market has become more effective, it's now likely that the carbon producing generation at Huntly, well, it has been reduced and could be reduced further.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Metiria Turei.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Is the granting of $9.6 million this year to help multi-billion-dollar companies like Anadarko and ExxonMobil search for more oil in New Zealand not an example of the taxpayer subsidising the fossil fuel industry?
The Honourable Bill English on behalf of the Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, no. And if the member can't tell the difference between government paying subsidies for petrol at the pump and government providing public funding to a research vessel to go and explore the ocean, then I don't think we can have a sensible discussion. Surely the Greens aren't suggesting we should now willfully cultivate ignorance of our ocean just in case some petroleum company decides to use the information.
Supplementary.
Order. Supplementary question, Metiria Turei.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Is the Prime Minister saying that it's not okay to subsidise the public's consumption of fossil fuels, but that it is perfectly okay for the government to use taxpayer money to subsidise foreign companies to extract more fossil fuels from around New Zealand?
The Honourable Bill English on behalf of the Prime Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, yes, New Zealand has led an international effort which is gaining momentum to encourage governments to remove their direct subsidies at the pump on fossil fuels, because all the work shows that could reduce carbon emissions by up to 12% simply by charging the market price. And a number of governments have been moving in that direction, many of their own volition, but certainly with encouragement from the international community. And I can only repeat again for the members' benefit that while we could have a detailed discussion about the tax treatment of activity around the petroleum industry, there are no subsidies to the industry. There's a series of tax treatments that have been put in place to achieve consistency and equity in our tax system.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Metiria Turei.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Is the government spending $8 million through NZ Petroleum and Minerals to map oil reserves in Nelson, Otago and Southland? That yet another example of the taxpayer subsidising the fossil fuel industry.
The Honourable Bill English on behalf of the Prime Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, again, it's a matter of whether we believe that the government and New Zealand should be willfully ignorant of its oceans. We think it's worth knowing. I mean, we pay tens of millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars for research in our oceans to understand what goes on out there, the ecosystems, in this case, mineral potential. Of course, that information could be used by international oil companies, but we think it's worth having the knowledge and taking the risk that they may use it, which we don't regard as a risk.
Supplementary question, Metiria Turei.
So will the Prime Minister now guarantee to the New Zealand public that no company that is engaged in fossil fuel extraction or exploration or mining will have any access to any of the information that the government subsidises in looking for oil or mineral reserves? There will be no subsidisation of that information.
Question's been asked. The Honourable Bill English on behalf of the Prime Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, I'm rather taken aback by this 20th century form of Luddism, or is it Ludditism? We are, in fact, a government who have the opposite approach, which is why we won't agree with the member, and that is open data. We believe everything the government knows that's not breaching privacy and confidentiality should be available to the public, even if they're members of the Green Party or multinational oil corporations. We're certainly not going to start hiding publicly funded data for politically motivated reasons.
Mr Speaker, supplementary.
Order. Supplementary. Order. Supplementary question, Dr Kennedy Graham.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. To the Prime Minister, has the government made any estimate of the percentage reduction required in our emissions in order for New Zealand to have its fair share of the global carbon budget consistent with 2 degrees?
The Honourable Bill
Mr Speaker, I suspect that calculation may well have been done, but I don't have the numbers to hand. The government is satisfied that the targets that we are talking about at the conference in Paris represent an adequate balance of our contribution to reducing climate change and temperature increase, with the fact that for New Zealand the cost of reducing another tonne of carbon emissions is higher than for any other developed country.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Dr Kennedy Graham.
What are the principles of fairness that his government has used when it decided on its self-described fair reduction target of 11% of 1990 levels?
The Honourable Bill English on behalf of the Prime Minister.
Well, pretty much what I've just said, Mr Speaker, and that is carrying our share of the burden of reducing carbon emissions across the globe on the one hand, and on the other hand balancing that up with recognising that it costs New Zealand more than pretty much every other developed country to reduce carbon emissions by another tonne because of the unique mix of carbon emissions that New Zealand produces.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Dr Kennedy-Graham.
With full regard to that unique mix, would he agree that if one takes account of New Zealand's per capita emissions, our relative wealth and our historical emissions, our target would be at least 40% below 1990 levels, not 11?
The Honourable Bill English on behalf of the Prime Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, all those things have been, I'm sure, have been taken into account. Some of them may be at a detailed level. But just by way of example, we have a very high proportion of our energy is from renewable sources already. And I note that other countries who are, on the face of it, promoting more aggressive targets than New Zealand are at the same time, for instance, shutting down low carbon emitting energy sources such as nuclear and expanding their coal energy. And it's going to be pretty difficult for them to reconcile those kind of conflicting objectives.
Question number 7.